Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest, Jenny Lecout, and she's here to share with us her new novel, The Girl from the Channel Islands. Now, what if the island you live on was suddenly taken over by Nazis? Inspired by true events, this is a riveting story of a young Jewish woman trapped on the occupied island of Jersey during World War II. Jenny Lecout was actually born in Jersey Channel Islands, where her parents were raised under German occupation and were involved in the resistance activity. She moved to England at 18, where she earned a drama degree and spent a decade in the alternative comedy circuit as a feminist stand-up. She also wrote for newspapers and women's magazines, Cosmopolitan Observer, and worked as a TV and radio presenter before focusing on screenwriting from sitcoms to sketch shows. So let's welcome to the show, Jenny Lecout.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I know, my goodness, it's such a well-written book. Everyone is loving this book. As a debut author, you have to be so just excited about this.
I'm kind of what we would call here gobsmacked, to be honest. It is a debut book, and when you write a debut novel, you never even think it's going to get published. I've been a professional writer for about 30 years, so I know a lot about the business, and I know how difficult it is to break through and get anything made. To have this be as successful as it's been is absolutely astonishing.
Well, congratulations. I mean, it's such a well-written book. So I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, a few years ago, an historian that I know who is an expert in occupation history got in touch with me because she was trying to get an award for this woman called Dorothea, who is one of the people, of course, in the book. And it was a Yad Vashem award. And when she was awarded this, the story, which had been part of Channel Island history but hadn't got a huge amount of attention, suddenly became a known story. And there was a blue plaque outside the house where Hedy lived. And she said, this would make a great film or book. And I thought, yeah, it really would, because it is such an extraordinary story. And because I'd already written previously about my own family during the occupation years, I thought this would be sort of a nice companion piece to it. And I'd also done a lot of research about the occupation itself, which of course is something that your listeners might not know that much about.
When we talk about the occupation, it's really interesting. I think people, they hear about the Nazi occupation, but don't really realize how far-reaching that was.
Well, exactly. The occupation of the Channel Islands, which is where I was born and where my family were raised and where I was raised, it's a little known part of World War II history, really. The Channel Islands are a section of small islands. Jersey is the biggest of them, but all very tiny islands just off the coast of France, only about 14 miles off the coast, but always historically part of the British Isles. So when the Germans came across France in 1939-40, the Channel Islands were kind of the first British territory they came to, and the British were unable to defend them. And in the summer of 1940, the Nazis invaded the islands and occupied them for the next 5 years of the war. And that included my family, who had not been able to evacuate, got stuck there. And it was a very, very dark period of history for everybody.
Well, I know you also talk about, and let's share this a little bit. I mean, I know you've got your film that you really have based off your family's story. When you were doing the research for that, did it really help with the new book, The Girl from the Channel Islands?
Yeah, I've sort of been living part-time in occupied Jersey for quite a lot of the last few years. I started doing the research for the film back in 2012, and there's a lot of books written about the occupation. There's a few Channel Island historians. There's some websites. So there's quite a lot that you can read about it. And but to try and get a sense of it and to try to bring it to life is always tricky. I had the advantage in that because my parents grew up as children in the occupation and my grandparents were raising them, which was phenomenally difficult at that time. I was able to get a little bit of sort of personal background information about that. I was able to talk to my mum and dad about what they remembered. And I interviewed my grandmother, actually, a few years ago before she died, and recorded it about her personal memories of living through the occupation and what it was like to be short of food, and some of the adventures they got up to, which are pretty extraordinary, because my grandfather, who she was married to, was making crystal radio sets because they weren't allowed radios to listen to the BBC. And she had to hide the crystal radio sets under the mattress of the of her my aunt, who was a little baby then. She had to hide the sets under the mattress and go out for a walk when the Germans were searching the house. So it was a terrifying time for everyone, and stories like that kind of bring the whole thing to life for you, I think.
Yeah, especially when you realize that they were shipping people to concentration camps from there.
Yeah, there was a whole narrative that sort of came out just after the war and that persisted for a while, that the islands hadn't really suffered that much and the occupation hadn't been too bad there. And that's really not true. I think the British government had a vested interest in that version of events because they weren't able to protect the Channel Islands, and they weren't able to rescue them until after a year after the D-Day landings, and the islanders really suffered a lot. So I think there was a kind of a version of events that it hadn't really been too bad, but the truth of it was that it was very severe, and people who broke the rules and people who were involved in any kind of resistance and who got caught were likely to be deported to concentration camps, and that in fact happened to members of my own family.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, it was just such a horrific time that people were living in then, and to be that close to the war happening is just unreal.
Yeah, the Germans at the time, they called it the model occupation because they wanted to give the impression that this would be the very civilized and acceptable form of occupation that they would eventually have when they ran Britain. That was their plan. And for the first few months, it sort of went like that, but it didn't take long before the true character of Nazi Germany came to the fore. And it was a very difficult time for everyone in terms of deprivation and fear and semi-starvation. Very short of food, short of medicines. It was a very dark time.
So your feature film, which is about your family, what's that title? And where can people rent it and watch it?
Well, the film that came out in the UK in 2017 is called Another Mother's Son. And that is about my great aunt, Louisa Gould, who sheltered a Russian slave worker because the Germans used to bring Russian slave workers over to the islands to build the enormous amount of fortifications that Hitler wanted to put around the islands because he was terrified that the Allies would invade there. So they brought all this slave labor over, and sometimes these poor, starved souls would escape from the camps they were on, but of course they couldn't get off the island, so local people would take them in, and that's what my family did, and that's what Another Mother's Son is about. It's on Amazon Prime at the moment, so if people want to check that out, that's kind of a background, but of course there's a lot more detail in the book, in The Girl from the Channel Islands, because in a 90-page film script you don't really have time to deal with a lot of the background stories that are going on. So The Girl from the Channel Islands was kind of a good place to put a lot of the information that I hadn't had room for.
I just love how the both of them really kind of come together, because it's educating, a whole generation that may not have heard of, you get people today that say, well, they haven't heard about the German occupation, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But I think it's important for people to remember what has happened, so we do not repeat that ever.
I think that's really, really true. And there was some really frightening statistics that came out of the UK fairly recently that said that something like 20% of young people had never heard of the Holocaust or were not convinced that it happened. If you get a misreading and misinformation of history like that, then absolutely you are doomed to repeat it. So I think that perhaps at the moment, more than ever, stories like this are really important, and people need to know what happened.
Yeah, without a doubt. When you were doing your research for The Girl from the Channel Islands, was that something that took you a lot of time, or was there a lot of information on Hedy?
Well, the bulk of the story, of course, is the background to the occupation itself. In terms of the story of Hedy and Dorothea and Kurt and the people who were all, based on the real people who existed, not that much is known about their life in Jersey. We do know the bare facts, and that forms the foundation of the story of the book, which is Hedy arrived in Jersey in 1938 because she had crossed Europe to escape the Anschluss in Austria. Her own parents had sent the family away for fear of what might happen. And Hedy ended up in Jersey, where I guess she thought she was safe because obviously she was aware of what was coming, but I don't think anyone had any idea that the Nazis were going to cross France that quickly. Of course, by the spring of 1940, she realized that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time again. But she had this extraordinary courage. And what she did was, when the invasion happened and the occupation began, we know that she got a job working for the Germans, which is in the book. And we know that she used that situation to her advantage, which put herself in enormous danger. And without giving too much away, without wishing to spoil too much of the book for people, we also know that when she was caught, that she had to escape, and she had to escape and somehow disappear on the island. And that's basically what she chose to do. And we also know that the person who kept her alive during that time, with the shortage of food, was this German officer with whom she fell in love.
It's an amazing love story, and you have it so well written, how you interweave everything into it. I mean, you feel like you're there watching the German planes fly overhead.
Well, that's great, as I say, because we don't know a lot of what happened in terms of the personal relationships within the story, because we don't know how any of those people met. All we know is how they were connected, but we don't know how that came about. We don't know how the relationships formed and developed between them. So it is a fictionalized account. And I had to basically use what seemed to me to be the most natural and authentic way of bringing those people together, knowing what I did about the history of the occupation, and I guess to some extent trying to put yourself in that situation.
So when you were writing Hedy's, part, Dorothy and Kurt, was there times when it felt like the characters were kind of living, breathing, people around you, and you were just recording their story?
They certainly do become real to you. Actually, one of the nicest compliments I had from a friend of mine who read the book recently, he said that during the time he was reading it, when he wasn't actually reading the book, when he went away to do other things, he found himself worrying about the characters and what they were doing and if they were okay. And I think that's a great compliment. That's if somebody becomes real to you to that extent, that's a great compliment to a writer, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt, because you have the reader so invested. They want to see what happens, and they're really learning so much along the way, especially with a story like this.
Yeah, well, I hope so. It's about making such a fantastical story sort of seem true to people, because in some ways it almost feels implausible, but we know that these things in some form or another did occur. So it's trying to make it plausible for people. The issue of a Jewish woman falling in love with someone who was a serving officer on the other side of the war is a pretty extraordinary thing. So it's it's trying to make that come alive, and trying to take the characters through the steps that you think that they probably would have gone through themselves.
Did you have a lot of rewrites on some of this where you'd start writing and all of a sudden it's like, no, we're not going in this direction, and it would go in a totally different direction?
Well, in terms of writing, I'm a big planner. And I think that's because I worked in screen for such a long time. If you work in TV and film, as I did, then you are encouraged quite early on to do scene breakdowns and to plan exactly what you're going to write, because there's no spare in that format. You have to be very, very concise. So when I started putting the story of The Girl from the Channel Islands together, I basically structured it the same way that I would with a film script, is that, you come up with acts, you think about halfway points, you think about turning points in the story, and then try and work what you think probably happened amongst those people, and try and kind of encourage that within the narrative framework that you've got. So I'm not someone who just sits down and starts writing, okay, scene one, what happens here? I mean, I know some people work like that, and I have no idea how they do it.
Well, do you sit down in one sitting and just let it pour from you, or is it something that you have certain writing times? I mean, what does that look for you?
Well, I do. When I'm working on something, I do try and keep to a fairly regular kind of daily routine, because writing is essentially a job like any other job, and I sort of see myself as an artisan, really. If you were learning how to build a brick wall or how to throw a pot, then you would sit down and you would have to go through various stages with it, and you would have to learn certain things. And I think writing is exactly like that. I don't think there's any great mystery to it. I think it's a craft which anyone with a flair for language can learn to do. But it takes a long time, like anything else. It's something that is relatively easy to be okay at, but to get past okay and to get into areas of knowing what you're doing, I think takes a number of years. I always say to people, I've been doing this now professionally for about 30 years, and I think I'm just starting to get the hang of it. But I hope that I write the best things, just in my last couple of years, basically.
Well, if you write like this, I can't wait to see what you do next, So it's an amazing book, just very well written. And it's interesting, because you've done so much research for both this and your future film. Was there anything when you were doing your research for both that surprised you?
I suppose that the thing that astonished me when the film came out in 2017 was how many people said to me, we had no idea that any of this happened. And these were friends of mine who a lot of them were sort of teachers and writers and professional people, a lot of whom had been to university, all of whom had grown up in Britain, and yet they had really had no idea about the Channel Islands history. And that really did surprise me. So it kind of makes you want to go on and write more about it and give people some sort of sense of perspective of what occurred. In terms of individual stories, because there's been a number of books written by people who lived through the occupation, and a few other novels as well. And you can pick out little bits from all of those stories and find individual moments that are truly astonishing. I remember one story from a wonderful guy called Bob Le Sueur, who's 100 years old now. And he was actually part of my family story. He actually knew my family and was involved in that. And I spoke to him about the research for this when I was researching both projects. And Bob told me a story of when he was living there as a young man during the occupation, and he'd taken a radio, which of course was an illegal thing to have at that point, to be repaired by a guy who had promised to repair it for him. That of course was a risk because he didn't know who you could trust. And then he brought it home, and as he was sneaking it into his house, the cable of the radio came loose, and the plug got caught in the garden gate as he was trying to sneak it into the house. And he is absolutely certain that the sentry guard who was kind of only a few yards away from him, turned round, probably saw it and just turned the other way and ignored it. But he managed to kind of quickly wind it in and rush into the house. Stories like that give you a real sense of the fear that people lived in, and how terrifying it must have been.
Well, especially as resources become more scarce. I mean, people do some very interesting things just to stay alive.
Absolutely. I mean, the hardest time certainly was the last year of the war, and certainly the second half of 1944, because once the Allies once D-Day had occurred and the Allies had landed in France, I think the Channel Islanders at that point all thought, this is it, we're going to be liberated any day, and their hopes were raised. But as the weeks went by, they realised that basically the Allies had gone around them, because the Allied forces just couldn't spare the amount of resources, the men and machinery it would have taken to cut through those fortifications on the island. So they said, we're going to have to make some headway across France, and then we will come back for the islands later. And during that period, they became cut off both from England and France, and very nearly starved to death. If it hadn't been for the Red Cross ships that arrived just before New Year at the end of 44, even more people would have died. There were people who died of starvation during that time.
Oh boy, it's heartbreaking to hear. But again, it's so important. This book is so important, I think, for people to read, because it really, drives home the sense of what it was like. I feel like, you're probably right. Like, most Americans have no idea the Channel Islands were, were under German occupation.
Well, of course, if you say Jersey to most Americans, they will automatically think of New Jersey. But New Jersey is actually, it was named for Jersey and the Channel Islands.
Yeah, I know. I was double checking and looking everything up on the map myself. So when you were writing and really kind of immersing yourself in your writing, did you go to the Channel Islands at all and spend more time there?
Well, I still have family there myself. My dad still lives there. He's getting on now, but he's still alive. And I have an aunt and uncle there, and cousins. So in normal times, I go there fairly frequently. Over the last few years, I've been there a lot. I went over for the premiere of the film. I obviously was there a lot for the research period, and I've been to the Jersey Archives, which is a wonderful resource, a number of times. And in 2019, I was there for a small local film festival run by some old friends of mine. So, yeah, I do go over as often as I can. But of course, this year, no one has been anywhere. It means a boat or a plane to get there. And that's just not been possible during the pandemic. So, yeah, I'm hoping to, maybe if things go well, I'd like to get over there later this year, if that's possible.
Oh, it sounds like it's a lovely place. And I could just imagine the pride that the residents of the Channel Islands felt when they were able to see your feature film. They must have really enjoyed being there and just seeing their history told.
Well, I hope so. The premiere that I went to there was one of the most emotional nights that I've had, actually, because the local war museum put on a special preview and invited a small select group to come and see it. And it was about 80 people, and they specifically invited older people who had actually lived themselves through the occupation. And I went over there with Julian Kostov, who played the Russian slave worker in the film, and to watch it, watch the film being played to people who'd actually experienced it, and to have my dad there and his sister, who had experienced it as children. That was a really extraordinary occasion. It was amazing.
Have you gotten any feedback from the residents in regards to your book? It's flying off the shelves, I'm sure.
I know that my family have enjoyed it. It came out, of course, in the middle of the pandemic, and all the bookshops were shut. So it was a tricky launch in this country. I think it's probably had a more successful launch on your side of the Atlantic. But yeah, I mean the response has been great, and I'm really enjoying reading all the reviews, and yeah, it's really interesting to get that sort of feedback. Even my dad sent me an email and said, "Hey, I read your book and I'm very proud of you." That's a nice feeling.
Well, especially because there's some way that maybe there's some light memory, or they've got family talking about it, but they lived it. So to see it and have everything come together, I'm sure they're very proud of you.
Well, it's a funny story actually that my dad told me. It might have been my his mother, who told me this actually, because I don't know if he remembered, because he was 5 years old, my dad, when the occupation began, when the planes came over. Because the reason that happened is that they didn't realise that the islands had been demilitarised. The British government hadn't informed the German authorities that they had completely walked away from the islands and left them defenceless, because they thought it would be bad for morale. So when they saw all the trucks lined up at the docks full of vegetables for export, they assumed that was military trucks, and they strafed it and bombed it, and a number of people died. And as the planes flew over, my dad, who was 5 years old then, rushed out into the garden, and he had a little tin hat and a little toy gun. And he rushed out into the garden and was shooting at the sky and saying, "Don't worry, Mummy, I'm going to get those Germans for you." And she had to rush out into the garden and say, "Sweetheart, it's not a game. You've actually got to come in. These are real bombs. These are real bombing planes. And I'm afraid you can't play out here now, and you're not going to be able to play outside anymore." And had to take him into the house. So, yeah, it's those little moments that kind of bring it to life, I think.
Well, my goodness, Jenny, I mean, we can talk forever. I'm just a huge fan of your book, The Girl from the Channel Islands. I cannot wait to dive into the movie. I'm going to be renting that tonight, Another Mother's Son. So I know it's available on Amazon. You could get movies in it, it's there. Yeah. I'm sure it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's
right?
on Amazon Prime, yeah.
Oh, awesome. So I'm going to go and rent it there, and I highly suggest everyone do the same. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Well, I have a new website, which is jennylecout.com. So they can see some pictures and a little bit of history of stuff I've done in the past. Or they can follow me on Twitter. So, that would be great if people want to do that. And I hope they go out and buy the books. And particularly, I hope they go out and support their independent bookshops as well, because the American Booksellers Association picked this book as one of their Indie Next must-read guides for February. So I'd like to thank them by saying, please go and support your independent bookshops there, because over the last year or so, it's obviously the smaller businesses which will be struggling. So yeah, obviously I'm very happy for people to buy it anywhere, but it would be particularly nice if they went out to small local bookshops and supported that.
And purchase it there. And I've purchased the audiobook. I thought that was fabulous, that you have that available for people who like just to have that going as they're walking and
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think audiobooks are a great thing, and if you can consume books while you're doing other stuff and you're doing the housework or walking or whatever it is, then that's great too.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, Jenny. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Girl from the Channel Islands. The Girl from the Channel Islands is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. Again, if you'd like to connect with Jenny, you can at jennylecout.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.